it, and I think we'll go ahead and get started because it's 1 p.m. And I'm the president and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. So I want to welcome all of you to today's webinar on Far from the Reset, Navigating U.S. Russia Relations and the Future of the New START Treaty. So we're going to look at, in general, U.S. Russia relations, and then focus on the New START Treaty, which will be coming up for extension next year. But what I'd like to start out with before I introduce to you our speakers is just to say that for those of you who aren't as familiar with Zoom, that we will be taking questions and answers, but rather than calling on people to ask questions, we will ask that you look at the bottom of your screen, and if you see the Q&A area, not the chat area. And if you have a question, please type it in, and the staff and I will be monitoring your questions, and then we will be able to pose the questions. If you want your question to go to one or other of the speakers, please feel free to indicate this is a question for Ambassador Kennedy, or this is a question for Tom Graham. And we will make sure that we try in the next hour to get through as many of your questions as we can. So anyway, I just want to first start out by, I'm really honored to have two experts on Russia who have agreed to participate in our discussion today. And I'll just start out with, I think all of you have the bios, but with Thomas Graham, who is the managing director of Kissinger Associates. He joined that firm in 2007, but he really had a long and distinguished career serving in the US government. And most recently, he was special assistant to President George W. Bush. He was senior director for Russia at the National Security Council, and also served as a director at the National Security Council before that. He most recently, and if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it, wrote an article in Foreign Policy magazine in October of 2019 called Let Russia Be Russia, which kind of gives you a point of view of how we got to where we are in our relations with Russia today. And Tom, as I said, had a long and distinguished career in the Foreign Service. He also was a senior associate at the Russia-Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So he's very well placed today to discuss with us his thoughts on U.S.-Russia relations. And we also have Ambassador Laura Kennedy, again, another foreign affairs expert who had a long and very distinguished career in the U.S. Foreign Service. She was U.S. ambassador to Turkmenistan. She also was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, and was the Deputy Commandant at the National War College. But she also has had a long and distinguished career in disarmament. She was U.S. Permanent Representative to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva and Special Representative for the Biological Weapons Convention issues. So that's quite a mouthful of a title, Laura. But it shows that she really has had a long and distinguished career in this area. And after retiring, it wasn't long before she got called back to service to serve as a charge d'affaires at the U.S. mission to the United Nations in Vienna. And she's also been a member of the Board of Governors for the International Atomic Energy Agency or I guess was until July 2015. So with that, I would just like to perhaps start out with you, Tom, with a question that I think many of our participants would be interested in. And, what's the status of U.S.-Russia relations now? I mean, I guess my personal opinion was I was encouraged when President Trump got elected and he pledged to try to improve U.S.-Russia relations. But now here we are, more than 3 years in, and it doesn't appear that our relationship has gotten better. And it seems that the ongoing pandemic may make things worse. So I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on where we are on U.S.-Russia relations, and is there any way that we can improve our relationship with Russia?
Susan, thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure to be with all of you today, virtually on this one. It's no secret that U.S.-Russia relations remain deeply troubled. They haven't improved dramatically or at all in the past several years. I think, in fact, you could make an argument that the relationship is as low a level as it's been since the middle of the 1980s. That is the later stages of the Cold War. There are a range of issues that trouble the relationship. We have different views on how the world order ought to be structured. We have a series of conflicts over various parts of the world. Ukraine, Syria are probably the most prominent at this point. There are questions still about Russia's interference in our domestic affairs, played a significant role in the minds of many Americans in 2016. It's something that's continuing, perhaps in somewhat different forms in the current presidential campaign, the election campaign. So the relationship is troubled. There was some hope that with the pandemic and the idea that this was really a transnational challenge of some sort, that this would lead to greater cooperation. But what we've seen, I think, across the globe over the past several months is that countries have largely dealt with this problem on their own without consultation with outside powers. So it's almost everyone save themselves if they can. And talk about U.S.-Russian cooperation have really gone nowhere. In fact, as I look at it, the pandemic is going to make it more difficult to move the relationship forward. Over the past several years, we haven't had the regular diplomatic contact that you need to conduct a serious relationship, to look for those areas of cooperation, but perhaps more important than that, to find ways to manage effectively and restrain the competition between our two countries. Now in the pandemic, it's very difficult to have any type of diplomatic contacts. We do some of this virtually, but the really important diplomatic work generally gets done face-to-face between and among individuals who have some confidence in one another, have known one another for some time, and have a certain level of trust in what they're hearing from the other side, at least as far as it concerns the actual position of the other side. That is going to be difficult to do for at least the next several months, and probably longer than that. And then finally, we're in the midst of an election campaign, and Russia will be a factor. It's hard to see any radical improvement in the relationship while that campaign is underway. So we're going to have to wait until after the election, and probably to the beginning of next year, a new administration or a second term for President Trump, before we can get engaged in a serious way in trying to stabilize this relationship and restraining the competition between our two countries.
What do you think in terms of, I know one of the sticky points in our relationship before I retired was NATO, Russia, and that the Russians, at least from my point of view, see NATO as a threat and as an aggressor. And would you see, how would you see the pandemic and this deterioration in U.S.-Russia relations as, would you see that as Russia is it a security threat for us? Do you think Russia may do something in the security realm that might be a threat to all of us? Or do you think that the pandemic has consumed them just like I think we're consumed here in the U.S. in terms of security?
Well, I don't see the Russians doing anything in the security realm that is directly threatening to the United States or NATO at this point. In fact, if you look at what Russia has done over the past several years in Ukraine and Syria, they have been reacting to developments that they saw as threats to their national security, to their national interests. It's not something, they haven't been proactive in that way. They haven't been going out in search of problems to create in order to undermine the United States. Now, what they have done and what they will do, I think, during the pandemic, is to look for those areas where there may be differences between the United States and our European allies. The Russians, for the longest time, have had very little interest in consolidating the transatlantic community, quite the contrary. But I'd like to sow some discontent between the members of NATO, particularly between the United States and its European allies. And given the discontent that has emerged in the past, complicated, I think, by the pandemic, there are obviously many areas where the Russians could, through various media techniques, try to exacerbate the tensions in the relationship and undermine, to some extent, the cohesion of the transatlantic community beyond what, I mean, many Europeans and some Americans say President Trump has done already on his own.
Yeah. Well, why don't I switch, and especially turning to security, to you, Laura. In my last assignment in Moscow, we were negotiating the New START treaty back in 2009, 2010. And so I'm very familiar with the treaty, but I'm not sure, I think some of our participants are, but it would be good if perhaps you give us an overview of the treaty and the importance of it, and what's coming up on the extension of the treaty. Because in my opinion, even in Soviet times, the one area that we in the Soviet Union and then later Russia could work well on is arms control and treaties. But it seems that, at this point in time, that may not be the case. However, perhaps we need to look for different ways to coordinate on arms control. So I'd be interested if you could tell us a little bit about the New START treaty and, its importance and what's the status of it.
Sure. One, let me echo Tom's thanks to you and the National Committee for organizing this today, and also send my greetings to anyone who is joining us today. And thanks, Tom, for setting the stage for all of this. I mean, certainly the arms control area, we see those tensions in the relationship very much reflected in arms control, which has been a central area of our relationship for decades and decades, going back to the original SALT treaties signed by President Nixon in 1967. But again, we don't pursue arms control just to have arms control, but because the two sides obviously that it is in their interest. So New START was one in a series of these treaties that we negotiated with Russia to get a handle on our extraordinarily dangerous, given their capabilities, arsenals. We first started to limit them and then actually to reduce them. And there has been real progress in that regards when you think that since the height of the Cold War, when there were roughly 30,000 nuclear weapon arsenals, we've brought down our levels 85%, but they're still hugely dangerous, having the capability, of course, to do massive damage, not just in each other's countries, but really to the whole world. So this latest effort to again enhance strategic stability was the New START treaty signed by President Obama and then President Medvedev in 2010. Then it went into force after ratification, February the 5th of 2011, with a 10-year duration. So we're coming up on the end of that treaty. Now, it's a treaty that was aimed at just the deployed strategic systems and the warheads they carry. That is our nuclear triad of intercontinental ballistic missiles, sea-launched ballistic missiles, and heavy bombers, and again, the nuclear warheads they carry. So it is 700 deployed delivery systems and 1,550 warheads deployed on those systems. Now again, I said it limits at 1,550 warheads from each side. Each side actually has in their total numbers substantially above that both in their active stockpiles and ones that have been retired. But still, it was a good stabilizing measure that was welcomed very widely internationally. One of the other benefits of this treaty is it had some of the most robust verification we've ever seen, with on-site inspections, exhibitions of equipment, data exchange and notifications, regular meetings of the Bilateral Consultative Commission, agreements to facilitate each side's national technical means for verification. And I would just say that as of currently, we've exchanged almost 20,000 notifications with Russia. So again, this has been a robustly verified treaty with no complaints on compliance of either side. But as I say, it's coming up on its 10-year duration. The treaty included a provision for extension of up to 5 years as is. That is, it's the treaty as negotiated would be extended with no treaties. And you can do that just by executive order. President Trump could do it basically, signing with a flick of a pen, no congressional ratification necessary. Now, let me turn to the current status and outlook. President Trump had long made clear his disdain for this treaty. Now, critics say that was because, or that it may have reflected the fact that it was negotiated by President Obama. But criticisms include the fact that it didn't include, nor was it designed to include, it was designed to include, again, strategic deployed systems. It didn't include Russian tactical nuclear warheads, of which, by the way, Russia does have an advantage. There was concern that it might not include new Russian nuclear systems, Russia having embarked on a major nuclear modernization program, as we have, although they're operating in different phases, with the Russian systems starting their modernization much earlier than ours. But primarily, Trump has focused on his desire to bring China into the nuclear negotiation, to replace the New START with a new trilateral negotiation. However, China has made clear publicly and repeatedly its refusal to start such a new negotiation, pointing to the fact that there is a massive disparity in its nuclear holdings and the U.S. and Russia. I mentioned the Russian and U.S. holdings. Russia is thought to maybe have at most 300 nuclear warheads. So again, massive disparities there.
But what do you think, Laura, about you mentioned
So,
you don't think the Chinese are interested in looking at a trilateral treaty, but what about the Russians? Even if we are interested, do you think the Russians would be willing to engage in trying to get the Chinese on board, or is this just something that the U.S. wants, or the current administration wants?
Yeah, no. Russia has not objected to China being in such a negotiation. They clear their desire to extend New START, but they would see such a negotiation as building on New START, not replacing it right now and letting it lapse. But they have Mr. Putin has also made very clear that it's not his job to force China into a negotiation. If the U.S. wants to start such a new thing, it's up to them to induce China to join. And in fact, the U.S. has really not made clear what it might be willing to put on the table in such a negotiation. I can certainly imagine what Russia and China would want to see.
Well, you know, that's very interesting. And I just wonder, what about the other nuclear states? And by that, I'll say, you know, others in the UN and the P5, so, and our allies. Is there any, have they weighed in? Is there any feeling one way or the other we should continue the treaty? I know we're out of the INF Treaty, but I just wondered what, especially our European allies, think about, you know, the treaty and whether it should be extended.
Excellent question, Susan. And in fact, not just our European allies would like to see New START extended, but our Asian allies as well. There has been a great consistency across the board on that, because they, like I would submit, many civilian and military experts in the United States see the value in this. One, putting caps on deployed systems, you know, extraordinarily powerful systems, but also for providing predictability, transparency, and so on, which helps preserve a balance, and ideally then could serve as a baseline that could be expanded on to tackle other broader challenges, such as tactical range nuclears. I think most people would agree we should indeed engage China in at least a strategic stability discussion, even if they may not be willing to engage in an actual, say, three-sided negotiation.
Yeah, I mean, I
But
would.
yes, New START has been wide support.
And Tom, from your perspective.
And moreover, I would note, in addition to our allies.
Go ahead, Laura, go ahead.
I was just going to say that in addition to our allies, it has been enjoyed very wide support around the world. Indeed, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has noted the New START Treaty in its last final documents. So I think there would be widespread consternation if it were allowed to lapse. Yeah. And again, under the terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, we do, as does Russia and every nuclear weapon state bound by the treaty, have an obligation to pursue effective measures to general and complete disarmament. So there would be a real sense of a huge step back if it were allowed to lapse.
And Tom, from your perspective, what do you think? We talked about U.S. Russia relations, but what's the status of U.S. China relations? I'm not U.S. China, excuse me, Russia China relations. Have they become closer as we have, our relationships have deteriorated, and is there anything you think that we could capitalize on there in trying to not just only look at, you know, arms control treaties, but in other areas?
Well, the Russian-Chinese relationship has improved dramatically over the past several years, and they've moved into a position of strategic alignment across a range of global issues. Both Moscow and Beijing saying the same concerns about a U.S.-dominated world order. They both like to bring the United States down a notch or two, play a more equal role with the United States on the global stage in dealing with security issues and dealing with political issues, in particular from the Russian standpoint. We've seen a dramatic increase in trade between Russia and China over the past 3 or 4 years. China has now become Russia's major trade partner. That will continue into the future. We see much greater cooperation in the defense area, not only in arms trade, that has given the Chinese access to many of Russia's sophisticated defense technologies, but also more recently in the conduct of joint strategic exercises. So the relationship is quite strong at this point, short of an alliance, but well beyond a simple partnership. Now, there are obvious tensions in the relationship that have historical roots, there are historical grievances. There are problems that emerge between the radically diverging trajectories of the two countries. China with a very robustly growing economy, Russia with a stagnant economy. China overtaking Russia as a technological power. But what outweighs all this potential tension in the relationship is the fact that the United States is conducting policies that both countries see as hostile to themselves. We have identified Russia and China as strategic competitors. We are engaged in a policy, for lack of a better term, we could call dual containment. We have a trade war with China underway at this point. We've levied a series of sanctions against Russia. And it is US policy at this point, I would argue, that is driving those two countries closer together than they would be under normal circumstances. Now, are there areas where we could move in order to somehow erode the increased strategic alignment? First point I would make is that we're not going to turn Russia and China away from each other in the near term. But certainly there are things that we could do that would make it less attractive to draw even closer together than they are at this point. But that would require a normalization of relations with Russia as a starting point, and the creation of options for Russia so that they don't have to rely increasingly economically and strategically on the relationship with China.
Well, one area where I think in the National Committee works on this nonproliferation related to North Korea. And I think that's an area where Russia, China, the US, and of course our allies in Northeast Asia would be interested in perhaps cooperating. And we know that President Trump had, at least earlier in his term, focused on having a relationship with Chairman Kim and looking for ways to get denuclearization of North Korea. And I would say that China would also, at least, and Russia, be interested in, a cooperation in that area. And maybe it's a question for both of you, but maybe Tom, what do you think? Is there any possibility that we could work together in that area? It's related to arms control, but also related to an area where there's a threat that I think would be a challenge to all of our countries.
Well, we have worked together with Russia and China on the North Korean nuclear program for several years. One of the things that we did, even when relations were at a very difficult point, is that we had a number of conversations with the Russians about the North Korean problem. In fact, Steve Biegun, now the Deputy Secretary of State, was our special representative for the North Korean problem, and had a number of contacts with his Russian counterpart. And by and large, my sense is that the American negotiators have found Russia at least not to be unhelpful in the dealings with North Korea. And we do share, as you said, this interest in bringing that program under control. I think the problem is that both countries, the United States and Russia, while they have this interest in controlling the North Korean nuclear program, look at North Korea in different ways. We have a different set of priorities. Clearly, the top priority for us is getting a handle around the North Korean nuclear program. Ideally, getting the North Koreans to dismantle that program. The Russians are concerned about that, but they're also concerned about stability in North Korea. They're concerned about the status of North Korea itself. They don't want to see reunification of the peninsula in a way that would bring American military forces closer to their own borders. So we have different priorities, and that puts a limit on how far and how smoothly we can cooperate, even in dealing on what is a very important issue, and that is the North Korean nuclear program.
I don't know, do you have anything that you want to add to that, Laura?
Yes, I absolutely agree with Tom that North Korea is an issue that we have worked with China and Russia on for many years. I think China clearly is the party that is a more central player, but Russia, I think, shares an interest in not seeing destabilization, which is, of course, in its own neighborhood. Let me add one other nuclear issue that I think Russia and China have in common, and that is, I think both share concerns about U.S. missile defense, interpreting it rightly or wrongly as a development that would undercut their own capabilities and put them at a disadvantage. So if we were ever to get to a trilateral negotiation, I would think that would be something that both Russia and China would pursue, have common interests in raising with us, something that has actually been a current, a negative current in our arms control dialogue ever since the U.S. withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty of 2002. Also, Russia and China, to a certain extent, related to these concerns over missile defense, have pursued common positions on space arms control. So in some ways, one could say that Russia and China, in some aspects, would partner with each other against the U.S. As I personally believe, we do need to engage China more directly. It is a very powerfully growing military power, but an actual trilateral nuclear negotiation would be of a complexity that we've never seen before and would take, I think, many years to try and tackle these very issues. If I could skip ahead in terms of what the next steps might be and whether Trump might climb down from his insistence that New START be replaced now with a new trilateral negotiation, would be perhaps just an agreement that the parties could conduct strategic security dialogues to start to explore these issues. That is separate from a formal negotiation. But as I say, these would be new issues we'd be tackling. And so to me, this would be a way to start getting a handle on this. Now with China, we've had about 3 sessions of our strategic security dialogue with Russia and the Trump administration, but pretty desultory affairs. There was never even an agreement on an agenda. But I think we need to have really serious, discussions to start exploring all of these different issues. Perhaps that might be enough for Trump to climb down from his insistence that we must start and negotiate a new trilateral agreement, which, if it's at the expense of New START, would be a huge setback for, I think, not just, the stability amongst us and Russia, but I think would have ramifications very broadly.
Well, I think we've got several questions from the audience, so I'm going to start posing some of the questions to both of you. And I think this one is from Jill Doherty, and I would probably put it to Tom. What she said is, what do you think Putin's motivation for wanting to extend the New START treaty? He rather suddenly proposed in December of last year that we should extend it. And given what Laura just said, that it's not clear that the Trump administration wants to extend it, what do you think explains Putin's support for extending the treaty?
Well, Russia has always wanted to extend the treaty. What they've done over the past year is try to make it easier for the Trump administration to extend the treaty. The original idea was that before we actually agreed to an extension, that we would discuss some problems that had emerged in the conduct of the treaty. The Russians had certain questions about our putting conventional warheads on strategic missiles, how we count certain things, and so forth. And there would have been a negotiation before an agreement on extension. The Russians now have lifted all those conditions. They say they're prepared to extend the New START without conditions, as is, for another 5 years, or in fact, for as long as the United States is prepared to extend it at this point. There are a couple of reasons behind that. First, Russia does value strategic stability, maintaining this bilateral relationship with the United States on strategic issues. It's a matter of prestige. It's one of the few areas in which Russia approaches the United States as an equal, so that's very important for them. They don't want to get engaged in a massive nuclear arms race. This is something that they would do if they thought they had to, but it puts tremendous strain on their budget. And it comes at a time when Russia really has significant internal problems. It needs to jumpstart its economy. It needs to raise the standard of living. It would like to be in a situation where it doesn't have to spend as much on defense in order to maintain that parity with the United States. So I think there are good reasons for why the Russians want this treaty going forward. They're practical, but I would also underscore it's a matter of prestige. Now, I could add just one other idea to that. One of the reasons that Russia is not eager to have a trilateral negotiation is not only the practicality of that, but if you bring China into the equation, to some extent erodes Russia's position as the sole equal to the United States in the strategic realm. So this is a matter of prestige for the Russians in a very, very large sense.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. Now, we have had a couple questions related to Russia and Iran, but I'm going to give you the first one here from Ambassador Pamela Spratland. Hi, Pamela. I'm glad you're here participating. And this is to both you, Tom, and to Ambassador Kennedy. Could we talk a little bit about the U.S. relationship with Iran and in relation to the JCPOA and how that may affect perceptions in Russia and China about the U.S. commitment or seriousness to a New START treaty in this area of security in general? I think, you know, for many of our allies, we're not seen as reliable. And so, you know, what are your thoughts about that? Do you think, either one of you, I don't know, maybe Tom, you want to start?
Yeah, no, look, I mean, what differentiates the New START from the JCPOA is the New START's a treaty. It was ratified. The Senate played its constitutional role. It's committed the United States to that. The JCPOA was done by executive order, which allowed President Trump simply to walk away from it. President Obama never submitted it to the Senate, in part because he was probably right that he wouldn't have gotten it ratified. Yes, the Russians are concerned. The Chinese are concerned that the United States withdrew from the Iran deal. That has complicated the relationship in the Middle East. It's also sent a bad signal, I think, to other countries about the future of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the U.S. commitment to that. But the New START is something different. It's a treaty ratified by the Senate. I think both Beijing and Moscow would have greater confidence that the United States would in fact adhere to the provisions of any treaty.
Do you have anything you'd like to add to that, Laura, or?
Yes, I mean, I think there are two very different agreements. I mean, one was a non-proliferation really agreement with a different set of groups. As Tom says, it was executive agreement, although Congress was certainly involved and set a number of parameters on our negotiation. And actually, I would say that it's not, I mean, a president can walk away from even a confirmed agreement, as, for example, we did when we withdrew from the ABM treaty. But I would also say that the New START treaty is one that is, you know, both sides have asked of each other the same things. We're both bound by the same conditions. We both designed an inspection regime that would operate in you know, for the entire length of the treaty. So they're very different types of agreements. And although, yes, I think the U.S. has paid a big price internationally from walking away from the Iran deal because there was no demonstrated problems with compliance. I think we took a big hit for that internationally. But again, the New START agreement is something that I think as long as we're in it, Russia, I believe, I'm sure believes we will adhere to the terms of the agreement.
Well, we have another question from one of our participants, Steve Kargman, and this is related to oil prices. And we do know that Russia's economy is very much dependent on the energy and natural resources sector. And, how would you, Tom, what do you think the collapse of oil prices, how will that affect Putin's calculus in his desire to pursue a global agenda, what he's done in Ukraine, Syria, Venezuela, et cetera. Do you think that will make him tamper what he's doing, or do you think it won't make a big difference?
Well, the drop in oil prices clearly will have an impact on Russia's economy. They're going to go into a recession this year because of the combination of the drop in oil prices and the economic consequences of the COVID crisis. I think they will pursue a less activist foreign policy. That doesn't mean that they're going to withdraw from Syria. It doesn't mean that they're going to withdraw from Ukraine. It doesn't mean they're going to stop doing what they're doing in Venezuela. You have to remember that Ukraine is suffering problems. You've got problems in the Middle East. You have problems in the United States as well. So there's no incentive for the Russians to back away from positions that they believe advance their national interest, unless the United States or their rivals in those areas are also willing to negotiate in some serious way. What I think you're going to see is a greater concentration on the economic issues, on the domestic issues, and at least a maintenance of where they are as far as the foreign policy positions are concerned in the full range of regional conflicts.
Well, we've also got another question, which I think is quite interesting, from one of our very good members, Hank Cohen, who's a retired Foreign Service officer that I'm sure Laura, you and Tom both know. What he wants to know is there something about Russian culture that makes the Russian people seek authoritarian regimes, from Tsarism to the Communist Party, and now to what he describes in the Putin era as a KGB. Is it something in their culture? Is it just something, how would you respond to that, maybe Tom?
That's a very good question, and there are, multiple views on that. I think, we have to remember that Russia grew up in a very harsh environment historically. In fact, Russia is located in a place where you'd never think of locating a major country. It's harsh climate, it's cold in the winter, very difficult to grow the crops that you need to subsist. And so Russia has always had a very conservative society. It has tended to be opposed to individualism because you stand out or step out away from the collective, and you fail, the whole collective risks losing its livelihood at the same time. It's also been a fairly large country historically, and there is some thought in Russia that you need a strong central power to hold this expansive country together, to protect Russia against external enemies and so forth. And they've had a history of dealing with external enemies. So there is something in the Russian historical tradition, in the Russian psyche, that tends to concentrate power and tends to see greater security in concentrated power than, for example, is the case in the United States or in much of Western Europe.
Yeah, and I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Laura, or you?
No, I don't. But I actually would go back, if I could, to just add a few comments about the question about revenues and arms control, and chime in retrospectively on that. And that is that my belief is that both the U.S. and Russia pursue arms control when it's in their individual interests. It is not driven primarily by dollars and cents. But Indeed, you cannot ignore that. Certainly Russia was able to embark on its massive nuclear modernization program when oil revenues were high. They've plummeting. Our country, of course, is facing unprecedented economic demands now with coronavirus. So it could be that indeed both countries will see greater incentive to pursue and at a minimum extend this very, very successful arms control agreement. Because I think on just speaking for the U.S. Side, I think there certainly has been a compact that to a certain extent, the willingness to underwrite nuclear modernization rests on a accompanying pursuit of sensible arms control with Russia. There could indeed be economic incentives, I hope, to pursue arms control. Again, that is not the driving force, but it certainly is relevant. And we are talking about very substantial sums of money. The U.S. nuclear modernization program amounts to about $1.7 trillion spread out over many years.
And I would assume that Russia would have to spend at least that much or not more, right?
Well, Russia actually has, we're on different cycles. Russia has completed a lot of its modernization program already, which is, one could say, is another reason why we want to keep the caps on under New START, because they would have a much greater ability, if the treaty were allowed to lapse, to upload warheads on their systems. But primarily arms control, when I talked about its advantages of predictability, it allows military planners to know what's out there and then to allocate their dollars and their money to what makes sense. And so if we lose that predictability, I would dare say, all of our U.S. military planners would find ourselves at a big disadvantage. And I think you can say the same thing for Russian military planners. They want and need that predictability. It really enhances our stability. And frankly, we've had a lot of references to the coronavirus today. That's already introduced so many instabilities and uncertainties and tensions on the world scene. So if we allow this arms control agreement to lapse, to me, that will just introduce even new uncertainties and sources of possible misperception in an already very tense international environment. So again, I think another reason why I do hope this administration decides to extend New START in the remaining 8 months of its lifetime.
One other question we have, it's from Gloria Starkins, and it has to do with Turkey, U.S. Turkey and NATO. We've seen over the past few years that Turkey seems to be moving closer to Russia, even though it's a NATO ally, use of Russian weapon systems. And what are your thoughts on that? Perhaps I'd start with you, Tom. How does Turkey fit into the equation? Is there anything that we need to be worried about seeing Turkey and Russia becoming closer?
Well, I think our major concern with Turkey at this point is that Erdogan is moving the country in an authoritarian direction and creating a political system that is actually inconsistent with the way NATO thinks of itself at this point as an alliance of democracies. That certainly wasn't true in the initial years of the alliance, but certainly since the breakup of the Soviet Union, that has been the case. Now, Erdogan has, I think, moved closer to Russia on some issues in order to gain some maneuverability, to demonstrate to Washington that he has alternatives, although for Turkey, Washington still remains the primary security partner. Yes, the Turks have purchased some or air defense systems from the Russians, but militarily they're still significantly, or to a much greater extent, dependent on the United States. Turkey has worked with Russia in trying to, and Iran, to try to deal with the crisis in Syria, in part because that was a significant threat to Turkey, and also because the United States was not willing to accept the Turkish position on the Kurdish forces in Syria. And also the United States was playing a much less active role in the region. You know, that said, it's clear that there are tensions, and there will continue to be tensions between Russia and Turkey. These are the two countries in Europe that have fought more wars over the past 200 years than any other European powers. That's one. They had continuing differences over Syria, some conflict and direct conflict between Turkish and Russian and Syrian forces in Idlib. And in addition, they're on opposite sides in Libya. So I wouldn't exaggerate the extent to which Turkey has turned to Russia in the recent past. Russia will try to build that relationship. Obviously, it has an interest in sowing some level of tension between Turkey and the United States. But the key to Turkey lies in dialogue between Washington and Ankara. And we haven't had an adequate level of that over the past several years.
Yeah, now I've got, in the interest of time, because I know we're getting short, I'm going to combine two questions. Did you want to say something, Laura? Go ahead.
I was just going to say that, again, I agree with Tom in terms of there are both positive and negative elements, but I still think, you know, Turkey is, you know, we have a lot of interest with them. But I would focus on one element, and that is, as Tom mentioned, the Kurdish issue. I mean, having served in Turkey before and dealt with it over the years, this is, aside from issues of authoritarianism and other ones, this has been the central complicating factor, I believe, in the U.S.-Turkish strategic relationship. And being able to manage that, I think, is a key towards you know, improving our relationship. But again, we are allies with Turkey. We do still share many common issues, despite the severe tensions that have crept up in recent years.
So I'm going to combine two questions in the interest of time. And the first is, and these are related to the pandemic. The first is from one of our members, Edie Holbrook, and she said, what do you think is behind Putin's decision to put management of the COVID crisis into the hands of governors in the provinces? And in addition to that, we have another one from Tom Kono, and this is probably, the first one maybe more aimed at Tom, the second one more aimed at Laura. Do you think the coronavirus pandemic would provide an opportunity for U.S. and Russia to explore possible cooperation on the issue of biological weapons, bilaterally or within the framework of the Bilateral Weapons Convention, which is a little more complex, but maybe, Tom, if you could start out, do you have any idea? Maybe I would just, in answer to Edie's question, say maybe he's following, you know, our lead, where our president is saying the states have to take responsibility. But any thoughts on that about putting?
Well, it's interesting because we always expect in a situation like this that Putin is the take charge guy who will decide to run things out of the Kremlin. Delegating authority to the regional governors actually makes sense in the crisis, given the disparity in settlement patterns and in the spread of the virus across the country, much the way we've delegated much of the responsibility for dealing with the virus to the states in the United States. You know, that said, there is a need for a central government role. The central government needs to be providing more of the resources that the regional governments need to deal with both the public health and the economic consequences of the virus that they haven't done. And in a crisis like this, you do need a leader at the center who will project the type of sense of purpose and unity that helps a country come through a crisis like that. So it is somewhat surprising that Putin has delegated full responsibility at this point. It seemed to back away from the role you would expect a national leader to play in dealing with a crisis of this proportion.
And Laura, what do you think about doing some cooperation on biological weapons?
Well, sadly, I haven't seen any evidence of it yet. And in fact, we've seen a more charged dialogue on biosecurity issues than I can remember since the days of Sverdlovsk, when there was, an anthrax outbreak that was thought to be due to a Soviet bio lab. So sadly, I haven't seen it yet, which I think is a shame, because I think when we grapple with these issues, it argues more than ever of the need for the arms control community, the global health community, legal, scientific communities to work together to deal with bio threats, because whether you have a bioweapon incident, a lab accident, or a naturally occurring episode, the result is the same, and that is catastrophic disease. So haven't seen it yet. Indeed, I've been extremely concerned that our government is threatening to cut off assistance to the WHO, because I think, as I say, all of these different parts of the international community need to work together. There's a synergy between all of them that needs to be exploited. So I'm not seeing it yet, but I hope that many of the people on this call today can encourage their governments to pursue that cooperation. We need international cooperation now more than ever. But unfortunately, particularly with the U.S.-China charges, we are going in the opposite direction. And hi to Tom Kono, whom I very well remember my UN days. Well, thank you for bringing up bio issues, because they are in their way as important as nuclear.
No, I agree. And we're just about out of time, and I'm going to pose the last question from Evelyn Leopold. And Evelyn, I want to tell you, you did pose this question first, but I saved it till the end because I thought it would be a good way to wrap up the conversation, and having both Tom and Laura give us their thoughts on this question. Do you expect a change in U.S.-Russia relations if Vice President Biden is elected? So maybe we'll start with Tom. Would you expect that things will get better? Will we go back to the Obama reset, or what will happen?
Well, we're not going to go back to the Obama reset. My own view on this is that much will depend on the margin of victory in November. Even with a second Trump administration, if Trump were to win clearly, and there's no sort of evidence that Russian collusion in some way tipped the balance, then he would have greater latitude and perhaps would even want to go farther in improving the relationship with Russia. That said, President Biden certainly is going to be interested in arms control. I think one of his first acts would be to extend the New START for 5 years and then engage in significant strategic stability talks. My guess also is that he would want to re-engage on a range of issues. Ukraine, for example, we're not going to agree, but we haven't had a serious dialogue with the Russians on Ukraine for probably the past 18 months, if not longer. So what I would see is an effort to stabilize the relationship. I think a President Biden would also have greater latitude to reestablish or normal diplomatic ties with Russia, not bound by the suspicions that President Trump has. And again, this is not going to be business as usual, but it's going to be engaging with the Russians in order to restrain the competition. It's engagement not just necessarily to cooperate, it's engagement out of prudence and out of a way to protect our national security interests.
And Laura, your thoughts on if Vice President Biden gets elected?
I absolutely agree that one, Biden has made clear, obviously he's a proponent of New START and would certainly extend New START, but I hope it doesn't come down to that, and it will have already been extended. Certainly, there are issues that need to be tackled. Ukraine, absolutely. Issues of you know, human rights, Syria, chemical weapons, and so on. But I think that Russia would, I think, welcome a less erratic partner, someone who is, as Tom mentioned, committed to engaging on the whole range of issues, is a thoroughgoing professional, knows these issues, knows these people, and has for decades and decades and decades. So I think despite the fact that there would be issues dividing us, we would have a return to real engagement, a focus on diplomacy, and some real consistency in our relationships so we can tackle the many issues out there.
Well, our time is actually, we've gone over our time. So first of all, I want to thank both Tom and Laura for what to me was a very, very wide-ranging and very interesting and informative discussion. So thanks to both of you for your time and sharing your thoughts and expertise with us today. And for those of you who are participated, I would say one positive aspect of the pandemic is that we are focusing on doing virtual programs which allow us to engage people from all over the world to participate in these great dialogues. So as we continue, we'll have face-to-face programs sometime, hopefully in the future, but we hope to continue this kind of dialogue on behalf of the National Committee. So thanks to all of you. And again, thanks again to Tom and Laura for a great discussion.